Hey, so my name's Joe Belsterling. You guys briefly heard some of my story. To share a little bit more, uh, I'm about to be 25. I run an education technology company. Used to live in DC, just moved to Richmond, Virginia 2 months ago. I love really, really bad and poorly made rom-coms. And I also love anything to do with the outdoors and college basketball. And I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. So when I was 5 and 6 years old, I was molested. I don't really know how many times, probably well over 100, by a close family friend and a teacher. And he was a pretty depraved individual. So there were threats made to myself and my family, abuse, physical abuse, molestation, and all of that other stuff as well. And eventually I ended up coming forward and meeting with Child Protective Services to get him arrested, and found out that 3 or 4, maybe even 5 other boys in our school had been molested and abused as well. Some of them had even more severe cases than myself, being beaten with baseball bats for threatening to come forward. Others were a little more mild cases. But I had some pretty dark years throughout my middle school and high school and college careers because of this. I don't know the college sexual assault statistics as well because child abuse is more of my world, but I know both pretty fairly well. And the average lifespan of somebody who's abused more than 6 times as a child is over 11 years shorter than the average person in America because of alcohol, drugs, and suicide and self-harm. And as I was going through my development and getting over this, I dealt with every single one of those. I struggled with borderline drug addiction, struggled with alcoholism. I've cut myself more times than I care to share, and have stood on top of 10-story buildings getting ready to jump, have tried to overdose, and have gone through all of those ups and downs as well. And, eventually I got to college, and I had love and support of a community that helped me try to move on and helped me try to find healing. And as I was doing that, I wanted to start passing that forward and using what I had been through to help others. And so I started speaking. I partook in things like this film, spoke to thousands of people, across the state in the Mid-Atlantic. But starting about a year ago, actually now a year and a half ago, the talk that I give completely changed. And I want to tell you that story, why, because it's a much more powerful story. So about a year and a half ago, last February, I was filling out my victim notification form because the person who had abused me was being released. Now, this is obviously a jarring and vulnerable experience, knowing he's getting out of jail. But I felt empowered at seeing how far I had come. And so I decided to take a leap of faith and watch the movie Spotlight. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that movie, but it's about the childhood sexual assault epidemic within the Catholic Church, and especially happening within a Christian school. There was just immense parallels. And so it was a particularly jarring film for me to watch. And at the end of it, I was definitely emotionally vulnerable, but I was really proud of myself for how far I came. But I just found myself thinking more and more about the other boys who had been abused alongside me and how they were doing and where they were at. Because there was one line that one of the children or one of the grown-ups had said in that film that I just couldn't get out of my head. And it was, "I'm one of the lucky ones because I'm still alive." About 10 minutes later, I got a phone call from my parents that one of the boys I had been abused alongside had just died from an overdose of heroin. And 6 months before that, I had seen his mom in a mall, and I knew he'd been struggling in and out with rehab. And I had told his mom that I would reach out and I would try to help him, and I never did. I don't blame myself for that. I know it's not my fault. I know he's not my responsibility. But what we went through, no one can understand. And no one could have been there for him like me. Nobody in the world. And I have to live with the responsibility of knowing that I never reached out, and I'll never know if I could have been the difference. And after I went to his funeral, I started getting really reflective and thinking about all the talks I'd given and all the countless survivors I had talked to and all the video and advocacy work I had done and speaking to the Senate. And I realized that we're doing so much as a society that's really powerful stuff to try to bring transparency to how often this is happening and what's happening. And the effect it's having in trying to deliver justice to these survivors. But there's almost nothing being done to bring that same level of transparency to the actual experiences of these survivors. And that's why 80% of individuals who are abused as a child have at least one psychological disorder by the time they're 21. That's why drug addiction and alcohol addiction skyrockets in sexual assault victims. That's why life expectancy is over a decade shorter. Because they don't feel comfortable in their own skin. They don't feel comfortable talking about or sharing what they're actually feeling and what they're actually going through. Not the fact that it happened to them, but how it happening to them actually impacted them. And then I looked at myself, and I realized that I was going all across the Mid-Atlantic speaking to people, and I was in a documentary that won an Emmy, and I was doing all this stuff, and I wouldn't even share with my closest family and friends what I was really going through. I never shared with anyone. Ever since I've been a kid, I've had to live with the pressure and the fear that because I was molested so much, what if I become a monster and molest others? I've struggled with sex and sexuality my whole life and those concepts. I've tried to overdose. I've cut myself. I've climbed to the top of buildings. I have demons. When my life goes well, I find myself craving chaos and craving things to go poorly because my brain was developed around that happening as a child, and I don't know how to handle life going well. And I hope no one ever has to know what this look feels like, but I've had my closest loved ones in my life look at me with a combination of fear and concern and pity when they realize that I've gone through my whole life never being able to actually trust anything. And these are just some of the struggles that come from bouts of sexual violence and sexual assault. And so as I started realizing this, I started realizing that we need to do more to bring transparency to these feelings. And the last story I'll share with you is of one that I experienced in college. I was in a room playing some drinking games with friends. It was a very safe environment. It wasn't, risky in any of that sense, but we were having a great time. And I forget what it was, but some question got asked like, what's the worst thing that's happened to you? You either have to say it or take a shot or something like that. And I just calmly and casually said, I was molested for 2 years of my life, and kind of moved on. And the room became so awkward and so silent. And my best friend afterwards pulled me aside and said, look, I'm so proud of you for where you've come, how far you've come, but you can't just say that. People don't know how to react. People don't know how to respond. You can't say that. And I said, if my parents had been divorced, I could say that. If my mom had died from cancer, I could say that. So why can't I say I was molested? And basically, it gets down to the fact that our society gets so uncomfortable with this issue that they don't know how to respond, which survivors pick up on, and then they don't talk about. And even if it gets to a place where they come forward and say, hey, this happened to me, they're not going to talk about how they're feeling. They're not going to talk about issues with sexuality. They're not going to talk about suicide, because our society is barely accepting the fact that they're just saying they were abused in the first place. And I told her, I said, I don't care if I made you guys uncomfortable, because no one's confident about the fact that they were abused and assaulted. And I'm going to be confident about the fact that I was abused and assaulted and that I don't care. And the craziest thing happened. And it completely changed her view on this entire issue. A year later, her best friend in the world called me at 4 a.m. and told me for the first time ever that she had a run-in, a minor instance, but a run-in with child abuse when she was a kid. And I ended up bringing this back up to that friend years later. She said, what are you talking about? And she's like, she's never mentioned that to anyone. And this was her best friend in the world. And the amount of times instances like that have happened in my life, I can't even recall. And it's because I just didn't care. And I told her, what you didn't realize is me saying that I had been abused wasn't about the 10 or 12 kids it made uncomfortable in that room. It was about the one person who was uncomfortable in their own skin because they had been that as well. And they heard that there was somebody else out there who was confident with their experience. And so ever since then, I've been on a mission to just bring as much transparency to these issues as I can. Not just the fact that it's happening, not just the fact that we need justice, because as you heard me talk about, justice does not bring healing. And justice is great for prevention. Awareness is great for prevention to protect future kids, but that's only half the battle. There are millions of current survivors, and each year 300,000 more add to that group. And those people need healing. Yes, justice is great. Yes, awareness to prevent future instances is great, but those people need healing. And awareness and advocacy and policy doesn't bring healing. Talking about the struggles, talking about the feelings, and being accepted by society is what brings healing. So it's not something that's easy to do. It's not something that comes without pressure. It's not something that you're just going to be able to walk through and handle, but it's something that we need. It's something that our society needs now more than ever. And that's where you come in. This isn't going to change until the culture around it changes. And it's not easy for anybody. Don't get me wrong, I'm not ignorant, I'm not unaware. When I was really going through healing, my best friend who stood by my side and walked through me with all of that and sat in the hallway the first time I ever went to therapy, and then just sat in the hallway afterwards when I broke down and cried in that hallway, there were times when she got sick of it. When I continually was doing too many drugs and becoming a douchey bad person and struggling with that and needing her to bail me out every time, her friends were saying, Joe's a hopeless cause. Why don't you give up on him? He's not going to get better. He's not going to change. When your friend, all they ever want to do is sit in and cry and be depressed, and they don't seem like they want to get better, it's not easy to keep sitting by them. And I'm not saying it is. I'm not delusional. But it's needed. Because if we don't bring that healing to those people, they're overdosing, they're committing suicide, they're cutting. And we're not doing anything to address that through justice. Justice doesn't touch that. And so until we get to a place where we allow people to treat sexual assault like we treat every other thing that's negative in this society, that healing's never going to come. If you lose a parent to a disease, it's a traumatic experience, and everyone knows it's a traumatic experience, and they're more than happy to console you and sit next to you and talk to you about it and talk about how traumatic it is. If you have your parents get divorced, they're more than happy to have support groups and make that a thing. But we still treat sexual assault like a scarlet letter. And even now we're starting to get to a place where it's okay to say it happened, but not to really actually talk about what you're going through. And until that changes, then these individuals are never going to have healing. But half the burden also lies on survivors. If you or your friends or anyone has experiences with this, they have to have the courage to say it. And I'm in a very privileged place where I can say this, whereas a lot of other people might not be able to say this because it would be deemed insensitive. But nothing's going to change until they have the courage to speak out more. Because if we don't speak out more, we're not giving others the opportunity to hear that with welcoming arms and to hear that with open arms. And so it's a two-sided, problem that we need to address. And I'm trying to do my part to help our society address that. But we all have a role to play. It's not something only survivors need to do. It's not something only non-survivors need to do. It's something that we all need to work to build a collaborative environment in order for our nation to really actually be able to address and bring the healing that this issue needs and deserves. So that's my story, and that's what I'm working on. That's why I speak at these events, and I'm very thankful to be here today, and happy to open it up to any questions. All right. If anyone wants to talk to me afterwards, say anything in private. I'm always here. I'm always happy to lend an ear to listen. I have my job, I have my life, but this is the biggest part of my life, and it will never go away. So I'm always happy to be a resource to anybody, and feel free to find me afterwards. So when I was just starting to kind of heal, I guess, I volunteered at a Fear2Freedom event at my school, and I've always been I'm a New Yorker, so I have a loud mouth, and I'm obnoxious, and I talk a lot. So, yep. So as soon as I decided that I was going to heal, I decided that I was going to talk about my healing. And I was volunteering at the event and just telling somebody my story. And I didn't even know this, but it was a girl who had just been raped a month ago or so. And afterwards, she was an intern with the organization, and she went up to them and said, we need him to talk. Like, he needs to get out there and share his story through this vehicle. And so then they were just incredibly supportive, and they actually hired a political consultant to just help me figure out how to tell my story in a way that was vulnerable and real, but at the same time not too traumatic, because it is traumatic to relive these things. And these talks are hard to give, and I have to really get in the right mental state of mind to be able to share that continuously. And so they just kind of really worked on helping me get to a place where I was ready to not just heal internally, but to, I talked with my girlfriend about this, but it's a scary thing having the most intimate thing about your life not be yours. I don't know who sees this film. I don't know how many people see this film. I don't know how many times it's out there. I see my name in places. And so that was a whole second process of the healing process. And me really getting comfortable with the fact that the most intimate part of my life wasn't going to be mine anymore. And then once I got to that place, contributed to the video with the other 4 or 5 individuals you saw. And then that started going well, so I started speaking at a lot of their events throughout the Mid-Atlantic, and have since just been trying to do my part when I can with advocacy and speaking opportunities. So.